The restaurant was too quiet for a room with 40 people in it. That was the first thing I noticed, not Marcus standing up, not the way his chair scraped back against the hardwood, not even the words he said. It was the silence that came before all of it, the kind that fills a room when everyone senses something is about to break, and no one wants to be the one looking in the wrong direction when it does. I was sitting at the far end of the table, between an empty chair and a man named Gerald Okafor, who ran commercial logistics out of Hoboken and had been my subcontractor on 3 projects over the past decade. Gerald had been telling me something about a permit delay in Newark when Marcus stood up. I remember that detail precisely. Gerald mid-sentence, fork still in his hand because it was the last ordinary moment before the room changed. Marcus said, "You're finished." David. He said it clearly, the way a man says something he's been rehearsing. Do you understand? Finished. 40 people heard that. I counted them later, from memory. The way I've always counted things that matter. 41 chairs. 40 people present. 1 empty seat where Susan had been sitting before she stepped away. I heard the words. I set down my fork, picked up my water glass, and drank. Then I set the glass down with the same care I would give a document I wasn't ready to file yet. And I smiled. Not the kind of smile a man makes when he's won an argument. The other kind. The table stayed silent. Gerald Okafor stopped talking. 3 of Marcus's own guests looked at their plates. I watched Marcus watch me, waiting for the reaction he'd planned for. The anger, the raised voice, the indignation of a man who didn't know what was coming. I picked up my fork and continued eating. The lamb was good. The restaurant had always had good lamb. Catherine Voss was sitting 7 seats to my left. She's a lawyer, Susan's oldest friend, sharp in the way that people who've spent 20 years in contract litigation tend to be sharp. I saw her watching me instead of Marcus. Her expression was not surprise. It was recognition. She had seen that particular stillness before, in courtrooms, in the moment just before something irreversible is said aloud. She understood what Marcus didn't. He hadn't caught me off guard. He had just made a record of himself. I finished my meal. I thanked the server by name. My wife's name was Eleanor. She grew up in Morristown, the youngest of 4 children, and she had a habit of folding paper napkins into small squares while she talked something she did without thinking, her hands always moving while her mind was elsewhere. She died 7 years ago, in the back bedroom of the house on Caldwell Road, on a Tuesday morning in March when the forsythia along the fence had just started to come in yellow. I was holding her hand. Susan was on the other side of the bed. Emma was 6 years old and asleep in the next room, and we had decided together, Susan and I, not to wake her. 3 days before Eleanor died, when the hospice nurse had stepped out, and it was just the 2 of us in that room with the afternoon light coming through the curtains, she looked at me and said, "Take care of Susan. She has a good heart, but she believes people too easily." I told her I would. I meant it the way you mean things when you're standing at the edge of losing someone completely, without reservation, with every part of yourself that still functions. I meant it the way you mean a promise you intend to spend the rest of your life keeping. I'd been in construction for 30 years by then. Not the glamorous end of it, not the glass towers or the waterfront condominiums. I built municipal infrastructure, drainage systems, road-grade retaining walls, the kind of work that nobody photographs, but everybody depends on. I had a company of 31 employees, a reputation in 3 counties, and enough contracts lined up to keep us running for the next 18 months. I was not Richard Brennan. I did not have a logistics empire or a name on a building. What I had was a company I had built from a single truck and a borrowed transit level, and a house I had paid off in 2009, and a granddaughter who called me Pop and liked to sit on the tailgate of my work truck and watch the crew pour concrete. That was enough. It had always been enough. Marcus Brennan came into Susan's life 4 years ago through a mutual colleague at her accounting firm. She brought him to dinner for the first time on a Sunday in October. He was 24 then. He shook my hand firmly, asked about the company with what seemed like genuine interest, and complimented the roast Susan had helped me make. I thought reasonable young man. Steady job, decent manners, nothing that set off any particular alarm. I've been in business long enough to know that first impressions are data, not conclusions. I filed him away and kept watching. The watching took about 8 months before it produced anything worth noting. It was small things at first, the kind of things that don't mean anything individually, but start to form a pattern if you're paying attention and you've spent 30 years reading people across negotiating tables. Marcus asked Susan more than once and in my presence about the terms of my company's partnership structure. He asked whether I had a succession plan. He asked at Thanksgiving whether the Caldwell Roadhouse was in my name alone or held jointly. Susan answered these questions the way she answered most questions, openly, without suspicion, because she had a good heart and believed people too easily, exactly as her mother had said. I answered nothing. I refilled my coffee and changed the subject. 2 years ago, in April, Susan called me on a Wednesday evening, sounding off in a way I couldn't quite name. Not upset, exactly. Unsettled. She said Marcus had been looking at her bank statements. Not their joint account, her personal account, the one she'd had since before they were married. She said he told her he was just making sure everything was organized. She said it in a tone that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as she was telling me. I listened. I did not engage. I said I was glad she told me. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The coffee went cold. I drank it anyway. The next morning, I called Patricia Chen. Patricia had handled my business contracts for 11 years. She is 55 years old, precise in the way that people who have spent 2 decades in civil litigation tend to be precise, and she has a particular quality I have always respected. She does not tell you what you want to hear. She tells you what the documents say. When I explained what Susan had told me, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long has this been going on?" I told her what I knew. She said, "All right, let's build a file." I told her I didn't know exactly what Marcus was planning, or when, or how far he intended to take it. She said, "That's fine. We build the file now, and we know what we have when we need it." Over the following months, Patricia documented everything that could be documented. In New Jersey, single-party recording is legal. One person in a conversation can record it without the other party's knowledge. I'm not the kind of man who records conversations casually, but I am the kind of man who understands that some situations require more than memory. I recorded 4 conversations with Marcus over the course of 14 months, all of them in contexts where he raised the subject of finances, the company, or Susan's inheritance. I did not prompt him. I let him talk. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. He said useful things. Patricia received each recording within 24 hours and logged it with a timestamp and a case reference number. I locked all of it away in a file that only Patricia and I knew existed, the recordings, the bank access documentation Susan had inadvertently provided, the pattern of questions about my company's structure, a letter Marcus had sent to Susan's firm's HR department without her knowledge asking about spousal benefit eligibility. Patricia called that last one the clearest signal yet. I called it confirmation of something I'd already known for a year. There was one mission left that mattered. Not the company, not the contracts, not the 31 people on my payroll who depended on the work continuing. Those things were important, but they were manageable. What was not manageable, what I would not allow to become manageable, meaning something I simply adapted to, was the possibility that Emma would grow up in a house where the person who was supposed to protect her was instead cataloging her grandfather's assets and waiting for an opportunity. Emma was 9 when I started the file. She was 11 now. She had her grandmother's habit of folding things with her hands while she thought, paper, napkins, the corner of a homework page. She did it without knowing she did it. I spent 6 months reading everything I could find about financial abuse documentation, custodial rights under New Jersey statute, and the specific procedural requirements for introducing recorded evidence in civil proceedings. I am not a lawyer, but I am a man who has read thousands of pages of contracts, municipal code, and project specifications over 30 years, and I know how to understand a document and what it means when something is missing from one. Patricia guided me. I did not engage Marcus directly during any of this. I attended family dinners. I asked about his work. I counted the ceiling tiles in their dining room. There were 11. I had counted them before. The file grew. Patricia kept it current, and I kept my promise to Eleanor, not loudly, not with any announcement, but in the only way that has ever mattered, by being present, by paying attention, and by making sure that when the moment came, I would already be ready for it. The house on Birchwood Lane was 28 years old. I had poured the foundation myself. In the spring of 1996, before the crew arrived on Monday morning, my wife Eleanor stood at the edge of the lot in her green jacket and watched me work. And she said, "You know we're paying people to do that." I told her I knew. She laughed and went inside to make coffee. That was the kind of house. It was the kind where the person who built it still remembered the weight of the tools. Emma came every Thursday after school. I'd pick her up at 3:15, and by the time we turned onto Birchwood, she'd already have her shoes off in the back seat. That was the ritual. Shoes off, bag on the porch, hands washed before we touched anything in the kitchen. She was 11, and she took the ritual seriously, the way children do when they understand that a ritual means someone is expecting them. We cooked together. Nothing complicated: pasta, soup, the occasional attempt at something from a recipe she'd found at school. I let her lead. I stood beside her and handed her things when she needed them and didn't offer opinions unless she asked. She talked while she cooked, about school, about her friends, about a book she was reading. I listened. I did not engage with the parts that were really about something else, not yet. Not until she was ready to say those parts directly. I noticed the change in October. It came in increments, the way most things I've learned to watch for do. She forgot her homework 2 Thursdays in a row, not the work itself, but the notebook, left at her mother's house. She went quieter at dinner. She ate less. She started watching the front door when I hadn't said anything to make her think anyone was coming. I kept a record, not on my phone, not anywhere that could be seen by accident, a small notebook, the same kind I've used on job sites for 30 years, kept in the locked drawer of my desk. Date, time, what was said, the context. I wrote down what Emma did as much as what she said, because behavior is documentation too, and I had spent enough years reading project reports to know that what's absent from a record is sometimes more important than what's in it. In November, she told me what Marcus had said about Eleanor. She said it quietly, the way children say things they've been carrying for a while, not dramatically, but carefully, as if she'd been rehearsing how to put it down without breaking it. She said Marcus had told her that her grandmother was a weak woman, that she had died because she wasn't strong enough. Emma looked at her bowl when she said it. She didn't look at me. I set my fork down. I counted 4 seconds. Then I said, "Your grandmother was the strongest person I ever knew." Emma nodded. I did not say anything else about Marcus. I waited until Emma was asleep. Then I opened the notebook and wrote down every word she had said, the date, the time, and the fact that she had not looked up while saying it. I did not engage. That was the discipline, the same discipline I use when a subcontractor tries to renegotiate a contract 2 weeks before completion. You do not react. You document. You wait. I tracked Marcus's patterns through Susan without asking her directly. I listened to what she mentioned in passing when he called her at work, when he came home, what he asked about. She didn't know I was listening for a pattern. I wasn't surveilling her. I was doing what I've done on every major project for 3 decades, which is threat assessment. You look at the variables. You identify which ones are moving and in which direction. In December, Emma told me Marcus had said that if she didn't behave, he would take her somewhere else. She said it the same way she'd said everything else quietly, watching her hands. I finished making her tea. I set the mug in front of her and sat down across from her and told her that no one was taking her anywhere. She nodded. She drank her tea. After she went to bed, I called Patricia. I told her what Emma had said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That changes the timeline." I said, "I know. We need to move the filing up." I told her I'd already thought about that. I counted the days we had left before the situation would become something I could no longer manage quietly. There were not many. Patricia said she'd have the amended documents ready by Friday. I thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the house Eleanor had watched me build, and I thought about what it means to protect something not loudly, not with any announcement, but by being the person who was already ready before anyone else knew there was a reason to be. Richard moved in on a Saturday in late October. I know it was a Saturday because Emma was with me that weekend. We'd been planning to drive up to Ringwood State Park, the way we did every fall when the leaves were at their best. I was loading a thermos into the back of my truck when the moving vans turned onto Crescent Hill Road. 3 of them, not the standard 2-man operation you see in this part of Morris County. These were full commercial rigs with a crew of 8, and behind them came a black Escalade that parked at an angle in the newly paved driveway, as though the street itself had been arranged for the occasion. Emma watched from the front steps. She said, "Who's that, Pop?" I said, "Your other grandfather." She didn't say anything after that. Neither did I. The house Richard Brennan had purchased was the old Mercer property, a colonial on 2 acres with a new roof, and a price tag I'd heard from my neighbor Gerald Tack, who worked in county assessments, was just over $2 million. Gerald had mentioned it 3 weeks earlier when we were both getting the mail. He'd said, "Someone's paying cash, closing in 9 days. Cash closings in 9 days don't happen by accident. They happen when someone has already decided what they want and has been waiting for the right moment to take it. I drove Emma to Ringwood anyway. We walked the trails for 2 hours, and she found a red maple leaf the size of her face and carried it all the way back to the truck. On the drive home, she asked me if Richard was nice. I told her I didn't know him well enough yet to say. She accepted that the way children accept things when they sense you're being careful with your words quietly, without pushing. The party happened 10 days after Richard moved in. I knew about it because Susan called me that Thursday evening, and the way she called told me everything before she said anything. There was a pause before she spoke. Susan has had that pause since she was a teenager. It means she is about to say something she has already rehearsed. She said Dad had been invited to a dinner at Richard's, a welcome party. She called it 30 or 40 people, some of his business associates, a few neighbors from the other end of the road. She said it in a way that made it clear she was telling me about it, not telling me I was invited to it. I said, "That sounds like a nice evening for you." She said, "I just wanted you to know." I said, "I appreciate that." We talked for another few minutes about Emma's school project and whether the gutters on Susan's house needed cleaning before winter. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and thought about what Richard Brennan understood about leverage. He had moved to Crescent Hill Road not because it was convenient or because the school district was good. He had moved here because Susan had told him where I lived, and Richard Brennan was the kind of man who preferred to conduct his business from a position of proximity. He wanted to be able to see the property. He wanted to be able to measure the distance between what I had and what he had, and make sure everyone in the neighborhood understood the difference. I did not engage. I called Patricia the next morning and told her what I'd observed. She said, "He's establishing social dominance in your immediate environment." I said I'd come to the same conclusion. She said, "Don't respond to any of it directly." I told her I had no intention of doing so. What I didn't tell her, because she already knew, was that I'd been counting the days since Marcus first brought his father up in conversation 8 months earlier. I had a number in my head. It was getting smaller. The meeting at the supermarket happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Richard moved in. I was in the produce section. I had a list Emma was coming over that Friday, and she'd asked for the soup I made with the small white beans and the smoked sausage, the one Eleanor used to make on cold nights. I was looking at celery when I heard him. Richard Brennan was a large man, the kind of large that comes from decades of good restaurants and not enough resistance to them. He wore a wool overcoat that cost more than most of my subcontractors made in a month. He had his cart positioned in the center of the aisle, the way men like him position themselves in any space, as though the space had been organized around their convenience. He said, "David Hartley, Susan's mentioned you." I said, Good to meet you, Richard. He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that arrives before the insult, so the insult can claim it wasn't one. He said, I hear you're in construction, building things. What houses small commercial, sir? I said, residential and light commercial, yes. 31 years. He nodded slowly, as though I'd confirmed a suspicion. He said, 31 years. That's a long time to stay small. I said, the company is stable. He smiled again, wider this time. He said, stable. That's the word people use when they've made peace with not growing. He let that sit for a moment, then added, Marcus tells me you've done well enough. For your scale. I looked at the celery in my hand. I set it in my cart. I said, it was good to meet you, Richard. And I moved down the aisle. He said something else as I walked away, something about the neighborhood, about how he was looking forward to getting to know the area. I didn't turn around. I counted the days. There were fewer than I'd started with. That evening, I called Patricia and told her about the exchange. I gave it to her verbatim, the word stable, the phrase for your scale, the smile that came before each sentence. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, he's not improvising, that was practiced. I said, I know. She said, he wants you to react. I said, I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the amended documents from last week, I want to add a section, something that addresses the pattern of conduct, not just the financial exposure, the behavioral record. I told her to add whatever she needed. Marcus began appearing at Richard's house with increasing regularity after that. I could see the lights from my kitchen window on the evenings he was there, the Escalade in the driveway, sometimes a second car I didn't recognize. Susan mentioned once, almost in passing, that Richard was teaching Marcus about investment structures. She said it the way she said things she wasn't sure how to feel about quickly, without eye contact, moving on to something else before I could respond. I didn't respond anyway. I wrote down the date, the time, and what she'd said, and I added it to the folder I kept in the locked drawer of my desk. The folder was getting thick. Patricia had a copy of everything in it. So did the filing system at her office on Route 10 in a cabinet she'd described to me once as fireproof and flood-resistant. Richard Brennan had moved to Crescent Hill Road to show me what power looked like from the outside. He had no idea what it looked like from where I was sitting. The BMW was white, not the kind of white that fades after 2 winters in New Jersey, the kind that's been waxed and detailed and driven off a lot by someone who has never once worried about a car payment. I saw it from the kitchen window when Susan pulled into the driveway, and I stood there for a moment with my coffee before I went to the door. Emma was upstairs finishing her homework. I had told her mother was coming at 4. It was 3:47. Susan got out of the car and stood beside it the way people stand beside things they want you to notice. She had her sunglasses pushed up on her head, even though it was overcast. She was wearing a coat I hadn't seen before. I opened the door before she knocked. "Ah, Beau," she said, and then she gestured back at the car with one hand, a small sweep, almost casual. "You see it?" I looked at the car. Then I looked at her. "When did you get that?" "Last week," she smiled. I upgraded. I asked where the money came from. I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear her say it. "Marcus's dad." She said it easily. No hesitation. He said I deserved something better. Richard Brennan had bought my daughter a car. He had stood in front of her and told her she deserved something better, and she had believed him. And now she was standing in my driveway at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon, waiting for me to be impressed. I said, "Be careful. Money always has a price." Susan looked at me the way she'd been looking at me for the past several months, with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite irritation, but lived somewhere between the two. "Beau," she said, and she said it the way you say a word when you think the person you're saying it to doesn't understand the most basic things about the world. "You're jealous because you couldn't buy me something like that. Your company is too small." There it was. I'd been waiting for it without knowing I was waiting for it, and when it came, I felt it the way you feel a door closing in a room you've been standing in for a long time. Not a slam, just the latch. I had built my company from a single truck and 2 employees in 1991. I'd put Susan through 12 years of private school and 4 years at Rutgers and never once asked her to keep a running count of what things cost. I had done those things because she was my daughter and because her mother, before she died, had made me promise that Susan would never feel the weight of money as something to be worried about. I had kept that promise for 31 years. And now Richard Brennan had bought her a white BMW and told her she deserved something better, and she was standing in my driveway agreeing with him. I did not engage. There was nothing to engage with. The comment was not an argument, it was a signal, and I had already received it. I said, "Take care of Emma. That's all I care about." Susan looked at me for a moment, and something crossed her face that I couldn't name. Then Emma came down the stairs with her backpack and her jacket, and Susan's expression shifted into something softer and easier, and they left together. I watched the white BMW back out of the driveway and turn onto Fieldstone Road. I went inside. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The coffee I'd been holding was cold. I drank it anyway. Then I called Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I needed to accelerate the timeline. I told her that Susan was no longer an uncertain variable, she was inside the perimeter now. Whether she understood that or not, she was carrying information she didn't know she was carrying, and she was doing it for people who had given her a car and told her she deserved it. Patricia said, "How long do you want to wait?" I told her I'd let her know, but I was already thinking about the dinner that Richard had mentioned to the Halverson family 2 weeks ago, the one Marcus had been organizing. The one with the guest list that included 3 of Richard's business partners and half the people on Crescent Hill Road. I was already thinking about what 40 people in a room looked like when the thing they thought they knew turned out to be wrong. I wrote down the time of Susan's visit. I wrote down what she'd said. I added it to the folder. The folder was almost full. The week after Susan's visit, Marcus started in on the neighborhood. I had been watching him build toward it for some time. Men like Marcus don't confine their behavior to one target, they expand outward, testing each new boundary to see what holds. I'd seen it in business, in contract disputes. In the particular way, certain subcontractors would push past the agreed scope of work an inch at a time until they were billing for things that had never been discussed. The principle was the same. Marcus had been working through the family. Now he was moving outward. The first complaint came from Joe Malone, who lived 4 houses down on Crescent Hill Road and had been there for 27 years. Joe was 72, a retired Newark PD sergeant who still kept his lawn in the kind of condition that suggested he had not entirely left the habit of order behind. He came to my door on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual. Joe was not a man who knocked on doors without a reason. He had a coffee cup in his hand and the look of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for several days. He said, "David, I don't know exactly what's going on with your family situation, but that son-in-law of yours is trying to take over the whole street." I asked him to sit down. He did. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing and told me what had happened. Marcus had begun parking his second vehicle, a leased BMW that Richard had co-signed for across the cut of Joe's driveway on weekday mornings. Not fully blocking it, but enough. When Joe had walked over and asked him to move it, Marcus had smiled and said he wasn't blocking anything. Technically, Joe had a daughter who left for work at 6:30 in the morning. Marcus knew this. Joe said he had watched Marcus time the parking deliberately, arriving just before 6:15, then leaving by 7, 3 mornings running. Then Marcus had spoken to Joe's son, Kevin, who was 24 and renting the basement apartment from Joe. Marcus had told Kevin, according to Joe, that the neighborhood was going through changes and that Kevin might want to think about his living situation. He said it pleasantly. Joe repeated that detail the same way I had noted it about Marcus before, how pleasant his voice always was. I asked Joe if Kevin remembered the exact words. Joe said he told Kevin that if things didn't settle down the way he expected, he'd find ways to resolve the situation. That's the word he used, resolve. I wrote it down. I wrote down the date, the approximate time Joe had heard this from Kevin, and Joe's name as the source. Joe watched me write it without saying anything. He had been a police officer for 31 years. He understood documentation. I told him I appreciated him coming to me. I told him I was handling it. He nodded and picked up his coffee cup and said, "I figured you were. Just thought you should know." He left. I went inside and added the entry to the folder. 3 days later, Linda Paulson called me. Linda was 68, a retired school administrator who lived directly across from Richard Brennan's new house and had never, in the 14 years I'd known her, complained about anything more serious than the township's leaf collection schedule. She was not a woman who used the word furious lightly, and she used it twice in the first minute of our conversation. Marcus had backed a rental truck into her property line while helping Richard move a piece of outdoor furniture. The truck had clipped the corner post of her aluminum fence, a fence she'd had installed the year her husband died, because he had always meant to put one in and she had finished it for him. The post was bent at 30 degrees. 2 sections of fencing had pulled from their brackets. Marcus had looked at the damage, told her the truck had barely touched it, and driven away. She had photographs, 6 of them, time-stamped, taken on her phone within minutes of it happening. She also had the rental company's logo visible on the side of the truck in 2 of the images. I drove to her house that afternoon. She showed me the fence. I looked at the post, at the pulled brackets, at the scrape in the aluminum where the truck's rear corner had dragged. I asked if I could have copies of the photographs. She sent them to my phone while I stood there. That evening, I forwarded them to Patricia with a note. Linda Paulson, 68, retired administrator, 14 Crescent Hill Road, time-stamped photos of property damage, willing to provide statement, truck rental company identifiable in image 2. Patricia responded within the hour, adding to the file, "Keep going." I kept going. By the end of that week, I had a documented list that covered 11 separate incidents across a period of 23 days. Unauthorized parking that obstructed 2 driveways, a verbal threat, the word resolve delivered to a tenant, property damage to a neighboring fence with photographic evidence, noise complaints filed by 2 separate households for gatherings at Richard's property that had continued past midnight on a Tuesday and a Thursday, a conversation Marcus had with the Halverson family's landscaper in which he had suggested, according to the landscaper himself, that the Halversons were looking to sell, which they were not. I did not confront Marcus about any of it. I did not send messages through Susan. I did not mention it to Richard. Every time I encountered Marcus in a shared space, once at the end of the driveway, once at the edge of the Halverson property line, I said nothing of substance. I nodded. He nodded. He always looked slightly disappointed that I didn't react. That was information too. I wrote it down. I met with Patricia on a Friday afternoon at her office on Commerce Street in Westfield. She had the file open on her desk when I arrived, and she had added her own tabs to the sections I'd sent her. She went through each item without rushing. When she finished, she closed the folder and set her hands flat on the cover and looked at me the way she always did when she was about to say something she had already decided. She said, "David, we have enough to begin. The property damage alone gives us a civil claim. The verbal threat to Kevin Malone is borderline criminal harassment depending on how a prosecutor reads it. The pattern across multiple households establishes a behavior, not an incident." I told her I understood. She said, "But what we have right now is a paper case. It wins in a courtroom, quietly, and Marcus pays a fine and Richard's attorneys negotiate it down, and in 18 months, it's a footnote." She paused. "What we don't have yet is a moment. A moment where Marcus does this in front of people who cannot be dismissed, people with standing, people whose accounts can't be explained away. A moment where he shows exactly who he is, in public, without a way to walk it back." I told her I thought that moment was coming. She said, "Then we wait for it." I drove home on Route 22 with the last of the evening light going flat across the industrial buildings along the highway. I had been in construction for 34 years, and I had learned early that the most important work on any project was the work that happened before anyone broke ground: the surveys, the soil tests, the load calculations that nobody saw and nobody thought about until the building was standing, and they assumed it had simply always been there. The visible thing was never the real thing. The real thing was what held it up. The folder was in my bag. I'd need a second one soon. I was not in a hurry. Marcus was organizing a dinner. He had a guest list and a room and 40 people he wanted to impress. He was building toward something too. He just didn't know we were building toward the same night. The radio was on the porch when I pulled into the driveway that Thursday afternoon. I noticed it because Emma never left it outside. She carried it back and forth between my house and her parents' place in a canvas bag she'd decorated herself with fabric markers when she was 9. Sunflowers and something that was supposed to be a dog but looked more like a bear. She'd shown it to me very seriously when she finished it. I told her the dog was excellent. She told me it was a bear. The radio itself was nothing remarkable to look at. A small Sony, cream-colored, with a telescoping antenna that Emma had bent back into shape at least a dozen times. My daughter Susan had given it to her 3 years ago when Emma was 8 because Emma had asked to listen to music while she did her homework, and Susan wanted her to have something that was hers alone, not a shared screen or a shared speaker, but a thing that belonged to her. I remembered Susan calling me after she bought it. She said, "Dad." She carried it to her room like it was made of glass. I remembered that. I parked and walked toward the front steps. The radio was on the second step from the top, which meant it had not been there when I left that morning. Emma had been at school. She must have come by in the afternoon, forgotten it, and gone back without it. I started to reach down to bring it inside. That was when I saw the crack. The casing was split along the bottom left corner, and the antenna had been snapped at its base, not bent snapped, cleanly, in a way that does not happen from a fall. I picked it up. The battery compartment had separated from the body. There were scuff marks on the top that were consistent with the edge of a shoe. I stood there for a moment. The afternoon was quiet. A car passed on the street. I set the radio down exactly where I had found it and went inside for my phone. Emma called me 20 minutes later. She was crying in the way that children cry when they are trying not to short, controlled breaths that keep failing. She said, "Grandpa, my radio." I told her I had seen it. She said, "Bo Marcus said it was trash. He said I was trash because I love trash things." She repeated that second sentence twice. The first time it came out broken. The second time it was very clear, as if she had made a decision to say it plainly so I would understand exactly what had been said to her. I told her the radio could be fixed or replaced. I told her she was not trash. I told her I would see her Friday. She said okay and hung up, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment before I put it down. I went back outside. I photographed the radio from 4 angles with my phone. I photographed the step. I photographed the scuff mark on the top of the casing. Then I opened the notebook I keep in my jacket pocket, a small green moleskin that Patricia had given me 18 months ago and told me to use, and I wrote Marcus Brennan, destruction of property belonging to Emma Hartley Brennan, age 11. Thursday, October 17th, approximately 3:45 p.m. Witness Emma Hartley Brennan. I put the notebook away and brought the radio inside. I set it on the kitchen counter. I made coffee. I documented everything. That was all I did. Marcus called at 8:17 that evening. I know the time because I had already started recording before I answered. New Jersey allows single-party consent, which means one person in the conversation needs to know the call is being recorded, and I was that person. I had known for some time that Marcus would eventually say something on the phone that he believed was safe to say because it was only me on the other end. His voice was the particular kind of pleasant that men use when they want you to understand they are not worried about you. He said, "David, you should teach your granddaughter how to live like a normal person. Those cheap little radios, that's for people like you. Susan deserves better than that. She always has." I listened to every word. I did not write anything down because the phone was already writing it for me. When he finished, I said, "Thank you for the information." Then I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The coffee was still warm. I did not drink it. I looked at the radio on the counter, the split casing, the broken antenna, and I thought about Emma carrying it in that canvas bag with the sunflowers and the bear. I thought about Susan buying it because she wanted her daughter to have something that was hers alone. I thought about Marcus standing on my front step and deciding that an 11-year-old girl's radio was an appropriate target for whatever he needed to express that afternoon. I had been patient for a long time. Patience is not the same as passivity. I want to be clear about that. Every month for the past year and a half, I had been building something that Marcus could not see because he was not looking the same way. My clients never see the soil tests or the load calculations, only the building that appears to have simply always been there. I had one mission left. I called Patricia at 8:34. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "We're ready. I need you to prepare everything for Friday evening." There was a brief pause. She said, "Which dinner?" I said, "The one where Marcus announces his victory. It will be the last time he feels like he's winning anything." Patricia did not respond immediately. I heard her set something down on her desk. Then she said, "I've had the documents ready for 3 weeks. I was waiting for you to call." I told her I knew. I thanked her. I hung up. The radio stayed on the counter. I did not throw it away. I did not have it repaired that night. I left it exactly where it was: the split casing, the snapped antenna, the scuff mark on the top because I intended to bring it to court, and I wanted to remember what it looked like on the day Marcus Brennan decided that an 11-year-old girl's most loved possession was an appropriate thing to destroy on his way past someone else's front steps. I went to bed at 10. I slept without difficulty. I had one thing left to do, and I knew exactly how to do it. The invitation had come from Gerald Marsh, who had been my business partner on 3 commercial projects over the past 11 years. Gerald ran a mid-sized civil engineering firm out of Montclair, and every October he reserved the private dining room at Alderton's, a restaurant on the second floor of a converted textile building in downtown Morristown, for what he called his annual review dinner. 40 people, give or take, contractors, architects, county permit officials, a few attorneys, people who had worked together long enough to eat at the same table without pretending to like each other more than they did. I had been to 6 of these dinners. I had never brought anyone. This year, I arrived alone at 7:15 in the charcoal suit I wore to contract signings. I sat at the far end of the main table between Gerald's project manager and a structural engineer named Bev Okafor, who had consulted on 2 of my builds in Parsippany. Patricia Chen was already seated 3 chairs to my left. She had been invited through her own professional network. She did work for 2 of Gerald's corporate clients, and we had agreed, without discussing it directly, that we would not arrive together. Catherine Voss, who had known Gerald through Susan, was at the adjacent table near the window. Judge Harold Finch was across the room, speaking with someone from the county assessor's office. I had known Harold for 22 years. Since a zoning dispute in 1999 that had taken 14 months to resolve and had ended with a handshake and a mutual respect that neither of us had ever needed to put into words. Richard Brennan arrived at 7:40 with Marcus and 2 men I recognized from a regional business profile I had read the previous month, associates from his logistics operation in Edison. Richard wore a jacket that was slightly too new. He moved through the room the way men move when they are accustomed to being the largest presence in any given space and have stopped checking whether that remains true. I watched him cross to Gerald, shake hands, say something that made Gerald laugh. Then Richard turned and surveyed the room. His gaze moved across the tables in a slow arc. When it reached me, it paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then he continued. Marcus sat down at a table near the center of the room. I could see him from where I was. He was talking to one of Richard's associates, leaning slightly forward, with the posture of a man who has recently been told something very good about his future and is still absorbing it. I had seen that posture before on younger subcontractors, on junior partners, on people who had just been handed a promise they had not yet learned to distrust. The meal began. The first course was served. Conversations ran in parallel across the room, the way they do when 40 people who mostly know each other are eating and drinking in a space with good acoustics and no music. I spoke with Bev about a foundation problem on a project in Chatham. I ate the soup. I drank water. I did not look at Marcus more than twice. It was during the main course, somewhere between the first and second pass of the serving staff, that Richard stood up from his table. He did not tap a glass. He simply stood and began speaking to the three men nearest him, but at a volume that carried. He was talking about expansion, about a new logistics division, about the kind of growth that required the right leadership. He gestured toward Marcus without looking at him directly, the way a man gestures toward a tool he is confident will perform. Then he turned, and he looked at me, and he said loudly enough that the two tables nearest to him went quiet. "You see that man down there, David Hartley, good builder, small operation. I hear the margins have been difficult lately." He smiled at the men around him. Some people hit their ceiling and don't know it yet. The room did not go fully silent, but the conversations nearest to me slowed. Bev set down her fork. Gerald, at the head of the table, looked up. I did not respond. I cut a piece of the chicken on my plate. I chewed it. I set the knife down parallel to the fork, the way my wife had insisted on when we ate at tables that mattered. Marcus stood up 4 minutes later. I know it was 4 minutes because I had been watching the clock on the wall behind the bar, an old brass piece with a white face that Gerald had salvaged from the original building. Marcus pushed back his chair. He walked across the room. He did not hurry, which told me he had rehearsed the distance in his head. He stopped at the corner of my table, close enough that Bev leaned slightly away. He said, "David, I think it's time you understood where things stand." I looked at him. I did not say anything. He said, "Your company is finished. The Delancey contract fell through, yes. I know about that. Susan doesn't need what you can offer anymore. Emma is going to grow up in a different world than the one you built for her. And you," he paused. The way people pause when they want the next words to land. "You're done. You're finished. Do you understand finished? In front of everyone here, I'm telling you, you have nothing left." The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation above the kitchen. Then Patricia Chen stood up. She did not say anything. She reached into the leather portfolio she had carried into the restaurant and removed a manila envelope standard size, sealed, with a tab on the upper left corner that I recognized as her filing system. She walked the 7 steps to Marcus's table and set it down in front of him. Not handed it, set it down. Flat. The way you set something on a surface when you want a person to understand it is not going anywhere. Then she returned to her seat. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not want to pick up in front of 40 people. He picked it up anyway. His face changed. Not all at once, it changed the way ice cracks, one line at a time, until the whole surface gives. Richard Brennan, across the room, had stopped speaking. 40 people. Some had turned in their chairs. Some had not moved, but were no longer eating. Catherine Voss, at the table by the window, was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who is deciding whether what they are witnessing is as serious as it appears. Judge Harold Finch, across the room, had set down his glass. Patricia Chen, 3 chairs to my left, had her hands flat on the table. I set down my fork. Deliberately, the tines touched the plate with a sound that was very small, but that I felt certain several people heard. I picked up my water glass. I drank. I set it down. Then I looked at Marcus Brennan, my son-in-law, 28 years old, standing in a room full of people who had spent decades building things he had never touched, and I smiled. Not the smile of a man who has been wounded and is hiding it. The smile of a man who has just watched someone walk confidently into a room and trip the wire he placed there himself. I said, "Thank you for that, Marcus. That's genuinely useful." Then I turned back to my plate and resumed eating. He stood there for a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then he walked back to his table. Catherine looked at Patricia. Patricia did not look back immediately. She picked up her wine glass, took 1 sip, and then, very slightly, in a motion that would have been invisible from more than 6 feet away, she nodded. Catherine turned back to her plate. She understood what the nod meant. I had explained it to her 2 weeks earlier in a conversation she had not been expecting, in which I had told her exactly what I needed her to do if the moment came, and what I needed her not to do under any circumstance. She had asked me one question: "How confident are you that he'll do it in public?" I had told her The dinner continued. Gerald made brief remarks at 9 o'clock. Awards were given a small plaque for a completed infrastructure project, a certificate for a firm that had reached its 30th year. I applauded when appropriate. I finished my coffee. Richard Brennan spoke briefly about his new division and mentioned Marcus by name. Several people at his table clapped. At 9:40, I stood, said goodnight to Bev and to Gerald, and walked toward the exit. I passed Richard Brennan's table. I stopped. Richard looked up. I said, "Richard, you'll be receiving correspondence from my attorney within the next 72 hours. I'd recommend you read it before you finalize anything with Marcus." I said it at a normal speaking volume, which meant the 4 people at his table heard it clearly. Richard's expression did not change immediately. It changed the way a foundation shifts nothing visible on the surface, but something underneath giving way. I left the restaurant at 9:43. The night was cold. I drove home on Route 202, the same road I had driven for 31 years, and I did not turn on the radio. I was in the kitchen at 6:15 the following morning when my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds long. It was from an attorney named Dwight Saller, who identified himself as Marcus Brennan's legal counsel and said he was hoping to speak with me at my earliest convenience regarding several matters that had recently come to his attention. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has been handed a file he was not prepared for and is trying to sound as though he was. I was still listening to the message when Patricia called on the other line. I switched over. She said, "David, Saller called me at 6. He's asking for a 48-hour hold on anything being filed." I asked her what she told him. She said, "I told him we'd be in touch." There was a pause. Then she said, "He's scared. The language he used, he's seen the documentation. He knows what's in it." I asked her if we were proceeding on schedule. She said yes. She said Judge Finch's clerk had confirmed the filing window for Thursday morning. She said the financial records Patricia had subpoenaed from Marcus's employer, the ones documenting the account transfers, the inflated expense reports, the 3 invoices billed to Richard's company for work that had never been performed were already attached and indexed. I told her to proceed. She said she would. Before she hung up, she said, "He walked right into it, didn't he?" It was not quite a question. I said he did exactly what I expected him to do. I hung up. I poured a second cup of coffee. Through the kitchen window, I could see the backyard, the oak at the property line, the fence I had replaced 2 summers ago, the corner of the garden where Susan used to sit when she was Emma's age, and the light was right. I stood there for a moment. Then I rinsed my cup, set it in the rack, and went to my desk to review the documents Patricia had sent the night before, which I had been waiting to read until I was certain the morning would be quiet. It was. Marcus's attorney called at 8:47 that morning. I know the exact time because I had just set my coffee mug on the desk and was reaching for the folder Patricia had sent when my phone lit up. The number was from a Newark area code I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice before I picked up. The attorney introduced himself as Gerald Foss. His voice had the careful, measured quality of a man who had been practicing long enough to know when a client had already lost. He said he was calling on behalf of Marcus Brennan. He said he wanted to discuss the documents that had been filed the previous evening. I told him I was familiar with the documents. There was a pause. He said that his client had not been aware of the full extent of the materials David had submitted to the IRS and to the Essex County Police Department. I told him that was between his client and whatever he had chosen to do with other people's money and other people's peace. Another pause, longer this time. He said, "Mr. Hartley, what exactly are you looking for here?" I said, "I'm not looking for anything. Mr. Foss, the documents speak for themselves." I did not engage beyond that. I had learned, over 31 years of running a construction company in this state, that the moment you start explaining yourself to a man who is calling on behalf of someone who wronged you, you have already given away something you cannot get back. I let the silence sit. Foss filled it, the way people always do. He said his client was prepared to discuss a settlement. I told him to speak with Patricia Chen. I gave him her number. He thanked me and hung up. I set the phone face down on the desk and opened the folder. Patricia had organized everything in the order it would be reviewed. The IRS submission came first, 43 pages, tabbed and indexed, covering the 2-year period during which Marcus had used a joint account he had opened in Susan's name, without her knowledge, to route payments through Richard Brennan's corporate accounts. The routing was not subtle. It was the kind of financial arrangement that looks deliberate from the outside and looks catastrophic from the inside once a federal auditor starts pulling threads. Patricia had flagged 11 transactions specifically. The largest was $34,000. The smallest was $800. The pattern was consistent enough that the IRS had opened a preliminary inquiry within 72 hours of receiving her submission. The second section was the police file. 4 incidents, documented with dates, times, and witness statements. Evelyn Marsh's account of the afternoon, Marcus had blocked her driveway and told her to stay out of things that don't concern you. The recording 2 minutes and 14 seconds of the phone call in which Marcus had told Emma, in a voice I will not describe here, that she needed to learn her place. The photographs of Emma's radio, which I had taken the same evening I found it and stored in a locked drawer in my office for 4 months before I knew I would need them. And a statement from Tom Gallagher at the hardware store on Elm, who had been present when Marcus had berated a delivery driver in the parking lot on a Saturday morning in March and had written down the license plate number on instinct, the way some people do when something feels wrong. Tom had given me that note voluntarily, over coffee, when I asked him about it 6 weeks later. He said he had been waiting for someone to ask. I locked all of it away again after I finished reading. Not because I was done with it, but because I had learned that there is a particular kind of calm that comes from knowing the work is complete. You don't need to keep looking at it to know it's there. The IRS contacted Richard Brennan by certified letter on a Thursday, 11 days after the dinner. I know this because Patricia called me that afternoon to confirm delivery. The letter informed Richard that his company's financial activity over the preceding 5 years was under federal review, with particular attention to a series of transfers that had originated from accounts registered to Marcus Brennan and passed through 2 of Richard's subsidiary LLCs. Richard had not known, apparently, that Marcus had been using those accounts, or he had known and had chosen not to ask. Either way, the distinction was no longer his to make. I saw Richard Brennan once, about 6 weeks after the IRS letter was delivered. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in the produce section of the ShopRite on Ridgedale, the same store where he had told me that stable was the word people used when they had made peace with not growing. He was near the far end of the aisle. He had a basket, not a cart. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. He looked at me for 2 seconds, the same duration as that first night at the dinner, when his gaze had swept the room and paused. Then he turned and walked toward the other exit. He did not say anything. I set the celery in my cart and moved on. Patricia told me later that the company had lost approximately 30% of its operating value in 90 days. She said it without satisfaction, just as a fact. That was one of the things I had always respected about her. Marcus was charged on 3 counts in Essex County financial exploitation, criminal threatening, and willful destruction of property. The exploitation charge covered the account he had opened in Susan's name. The threatening charge was the recording. The destruction charge was the radio. His attorney negotiated the outcome down to misdemeanor pleas on all 3. Marcus was fined $15,000 and sentenced to 200 hours of community service. He did not serve jail time. I had not expected him to. The law moves the way it moves, and what I had wanted was not Marcus in a cell, it was Marcus on record, permanently, in a county courthouse, with his name attached to what he had done. That is a different kind of consequence. It follows a person differently. Cornering a special operations officer wasn't a flex of power. Someone had once told me it was a tactical error because those men had already planned for every exit. Marcus had made that error. He had walked into a dinner with 40 witnesses and declared himself the winner of a contest he had not understood was already over. The charging documents would follow him through every background check, every professional license application, every future employer's due diligence search for the rest of his working life. He was 28 years old. He had a long time left to carry it. 2 weeks after the hearing, Patricia sent Susan the recording. I had asked her to do it not to hurt her, but because Susan needed to hear it herself, from the source, without me in the room to influence what it meant to her. The recording was 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Marcus's voice, Emma's name, the words she needs to learn her place, said in a tone I will not describe here, because I have already heard it enough times to know I do not need to describe it for anyone to understand what it was. Susan called me that evening at 8:40. She did not speak immediately when I picked up. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "How long did you have that?" I told her 4 months. She was quiet again. I heard something shift, not a sound exactly, more the quality of the silence changing. She said, "I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Every time something felt wrong, I told myself I was overreacting. I did not say anything." She said, "I couldn't even drive home after I heard it. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. I told her I knew. She asked me how I knew. I told her Patricia had mentioned it." She came to the house on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the hearing. I was in the backyard when I heard the gate. She walked across the grass slowly, the way she used to when she was a teenager and had something difficult to say. She sat down in the chair across from me. She didn't speak right away. I let her take her time. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were red at the edges. She said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know he was like that. Not really. I thought I kept telling myself I was overreacting." I didn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing useful I could say that would make the previous 2 years shorter or easier to carry. I reached over and put my hand on her arm. Then I stood up and hugged her, the way I had when she was Emma's age, and the world had felt too large, and she hadn't known yet how to hold it. She cried for a while. I let her. The custody arrangement was formalized the following month, 50-50, with primary school enrollment staying in Essex County. David was awarded partial custody with a structured schedule that Patricia had negotiated carefully, and Judge Finch had reviewed without modification. The $50,000 restitution for the destruction of property, the radio, and the subsequent documentation costs, and the assessed value of what Patricia had framed as interference with a minor's personal property within the domestic environment was ordered payable within 90 days. Marcus paid it in 2 installments. I put the money in a savings account in Emma's name. She doesn't know it's there yet. She will when she's ready. One mission left that mattered, and it was not the paperwork. I called Patricia the evening after the custody order was signed. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "David, it's done. You protected your family." Her voice was quiet and certain in the way it always was when she had finished something she believed in. I said, "The legal part is done. The rest of it is just starting." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. That part's yours." I thanked her. I meant it completely. 6 months after the dinner at the Brennan house, on a Saturday morning in October, Emma and I were sitting on the front porch with coffee mine black, hers mostly milk, and 1 spoon of sugar, which she insisted counted as coffee. The maple at the end of the driveway had gone orange, and the air had the particular sharpness that comes in New Jersey in the fall, when the season changes quickly and you can feel it in your hands before you feel it anywhere else. Emma was quiet for a while, watching the street. Then she said, "Grandpa, where's Marcus?" I held my mug with both hands. I thought about how to answer her in a way that was true and also something she could carry without it being too heavy. I said, "He's working on his life. That's all any of us can do." She nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the maple tree, and I watched her face the way she held it, steady and calm, the way her mother had looked at 11 before the world had complicated things. She was not smiling, but she was not afraid either. That was the thing I had been working toward without ever saying so out loud. A year after the dinner, Susan came back to the house again. She sat at the kitchen table the way she used to as a girl, with her hands wrapped around a mug, and she said, "Dad, I filed the final papers last week. It's done. I need to start over." Her voice was even, not brittle the way it had been the first time she came back, but settled. I said, "I know, I'll be here." She stood up and hugged me, and I held on for a moment longer than I usually would. She smelled like the same shampoo she had used since she was in high school, and I noticed that because some things stay, even when everything around them changes. That evening, after she had gone, I sat at my desk for a long time. The office was quiet. The light through the window had gone the particular gray-gold color it gets in the early evening in October, when the sun is low and everything looks like it's been left there by someone who intended to come back. On the corner of my desk, there is a photograph in a dark wood frame. My wife, Eleanor, taken on a Sunday in 1994 in the backyard of the house on Millbrook. She is laughing at something outside the frame. She is 34 years old in the photograph, which means she has been gone for longer than she was mine. I looked at the photograph for a while. I didn't say anything out loud. I had made a promise to her, the way you make promises to people you love, without ever formally saying the words, a promise that the people she left behind would be safe, that I would not let the world take from them what it had already taken from her. I had kept it. I turned off the desk lamp. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Outside, through the window, the oak at the property line was still. The fence I had replaced 2 summers ago was straight and solid in the early dark. The garden in the corner was finished for the season, the soil turned over and waiting. I made my tea. I sat down. The house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when the people in it are finally safe, and the work that needed doing has been done, and there is nothing left to prepare for tonight. That was enough. For the first time in a long time, it was exactly enough. The following Thursday, when I came back from the hardware store, there was something on the second step from the top, a small Sony radio, cream-colored, with a new telescoping antenna still in the extended position. A canvas bag sat folded beside it, sunflowers and something that was supposed to be a dog, but looked more like a bear. Emma had come and gone without knocking. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up the radio and brought it inside.